I was the person in my group of friends who everyone pointed to as the healthy one. And I want to tell you that being the healthy one is not the protection it feels like from the inside, and that the confidence it produces can itself be one of the contributing factors to the outcome it appears to protect against. My name is Thomas. I am 72 years old, and I want to tell you about the morning 4 years ago when I learned that the picture of health I had been presenting to the world and to myself was a picture with something behind it that the picture was not showing, and about what was behind it, and about what I have learned in the 4 years since, about the specific and important difference between appearing healthy and being healthy, and about why that difference matters in ways that the people who appear healthy are often the last to understand. I want to begin with who I was before the morning, because the who I was is the central irony of the story, and the central irony is the instruction. I was 68 years old, and I walked 5 miles every morning without exception, and had been walking 5 miles every morning without exception for 11 years. I did not smoke. I had not smoked since my early 30s. I drank moderately, the 1 or 2 glasses of wine that the research my internist had mentioned to me years earlier had suggested was not harmful and might be modestly beneficial. I was not overweight. My body mass index was in the normal range and had been in the normal range for 20 years. I ate what I understood to be a reasonable diet. Not the disciplined and tracked diet of someone who has made nutrition into a project, but the generally sensible diet of someone who understood the broad outlines of what was good for the body and who followed those outlines with reasonable consistency. I was, by every external and visible measure, the picture I described. My friends commented on my health regularly. My wife, Margaret, who has been married to me for 43 years and who is more perceptive about most things than I am, told me occasionally that she thought I was too confident about my health and that the confidence was preventing me from attending to things that deserved more attention. And I received her observations with the specific and gentle dismissal of a man who believed the evidence supported his confidence, and who therefore understood her observations as the loving concern of a woman who worried more than the evidence warranted. The evidence she was trying to point me toward was the family history. My father had a cardiac event at 64 and survived it. His brother had a cardiac event at 61 and did not survive it. My father's father died of what was described to me in my childhood as a heart problem at 59, in an era when the diagnostic specificity we have now was not available, and when heart problem covered a range of conditions that the current understanding would distinguish more clearly. The family history was there, and it was significant, and I had mentioned it to my internist, and my internist had noted it, and I had received the noting of it as the acknowledgement of a factor that my lifestyle was adequately addressing, rather than as the specific and ongoing concern that required monitoring beyond the annual physical that I attended reliably and that consistently produced numbers I was satisfied with. The numbers were satisfying in the specific and limited way of numbers that measure what they measure, and that do not measure what they do not measure, and what my annual numbers were not measuring was the specific condition that the morning revealed, which was the presence of significant coronary artery disease that had been developing over years in the arteries of a man whose lifestyle was genuinely healthy, in the ways his lifestyle addressed, and that was genuinely not healthy, in the ways his lifestyle was not addressing, and that the monitoring he was doing was not detecting. I had a heart attack on a Wednesday morning in October while I was on my morning walk. Not a dramatic collapse, which is the version that movies have made the representative image of the cardiac event, but the specific and building discomfort that began as a pressure in my chest that I initially attributed to the grade of the hill I was climbing, And that became, over the following 10 minutes, unmistakably something that the Hill was not responsible for, and that required the call to Margaret that I made while sitting on a bench on the walking path with the specific and concentrated calm of a man who was frightened, and who was not going to allow the frightened to prevent the necessary. Margaret called the emergency services, and they arrived, and I was in the hospital within 40 minutes. And the cardiologist who managed my care in the days that followed was the cardiologist who showed me the images of the coronary arteries and explained what they showed. And what they showed was the answer to the question I had been asking in my own mind since the bench on the walking path, which was how a man who walked 5 miles every morning and did not smoke and was not overweight and ate a reasonable diet and had satisfying annual numbers, was lying in a cardiac care unit at 68 years old. I want to tell you the answer to that question, because the answer is the most important thing I can give you, and the giving of it is the whole purpose of telling you the story. The first part of the answer is the family history and what it required that I was not providing. The family history I described was the family history of premature coronary artery disease, which is the specific and heritable condition in which the arteries develop the plaque that restricts blood flow at earlier ages and with greater severity than the population without the history. And the appropriate response to that family history was not the maintaining of a healthy lifestyle, which I was doing, but the maintaining of a healthy lifestyle combined with the specific and more aggressive monitoring that the family history indicated was necessary, which I was not doing. The annual physical with the standard lipid panel was not the monitoring that the family history required. The monitoring that the family history required included the specific imaging that allows the direct assessment of the coronary arteries and the calcium scoring that provides the quantitative measure of the calcified plaque that is the evidence of the disease that the standard lipid panel does not directly measure. I had not had these tests because I had not asked for them, and because my internist had not specifically recommended them, and because the confidence I described was the confidence of a man who believed the tests he was having were the tests that were needed, and who had not asked whether there were additional tests that the family history warranted. Ask about the additional tests. This is the first and most direct piece of prevention information I want to give you. If you have a family history of cardiac disease, particularly premature cardiac disease, meaning heart attacks or cardiac deaths in first-degree relatives before the age of 65, ask your doctor specifically and directly whether your current monitoring is adequate for your family history or whether additional testing is warranted. Do not assume that the standard monitoring addresses the family history. Ask the direct question and receive a direct answer, and if the answer is uncertain, seek the opinion of a cardiologist rather than relying only on the internist whose training is comprehensive rather than specific. The second part of the answer is the inflammation. My lifestyle was addressing the traditional risk factors that most people understand as the primary determinants of cardiovascular risk: the cholesterol and the blood pressure and the weight and the smoking and the physical activity, and it was not adequately addressing the inflammatory component of cardiovascular disease that the research of the preceding decade had been establishing as a significant independent risk factor, and that the monitoring I was doing was not measuring. The high-sensitivity CRP test, which measures a marker of systemic inflammation, was not part of my standard annual blood work. The test is inexpensive and widely available, and the information it provides is information that the standard lipid panel does not provide, and I am not suggesting that everyone needs this test. But I am suggesting that the person with a significant family history of cardiovascular disease should ask their doctor whether the measurement of inflammatory markers is appropriate for their specific situation and should receive a thoughtful answer to that question, rather than the assumption that the standard panel is sufficient. The third part of the answer is the stress, which I want to tell you about in the specific way that I have come to understand it in the 4 years since the morning, rather than in the way I understood it before, which was as something I managed well, because I did not visibly suffer from it in the ways that the people around me who suffered visibly from stress suffered from it. The managing well of stress and the not being physiologically affected by stress are not the same thing. I was managing well in the sense that I was not catastrophizing and not visibly anxious, and not allowing the stress to interrupt the functioning of my daily life in any way that required acknowledgement or address. I was not managing well in the sense that the chronic and sustained stress of a demanding professional life that I had been living for 35 years was producing a physiological response in my cardiovascular system that my visible non-suffering was concealing from me and from everyone around me. The cardiologist asked me about stress in the days after the event, and I told him the truth, which was that I was stressed but managed it well. And he said something that I want to give you because it reframed the question in a way that the reframing was genuinely new information. He said that the cardiovascular system does not distinguish between managed and unmanaged stress in the way that the person managing the stress experiences the distinction. The physiological response to chronic stress, the elevation of cortisol and the inflammatory markers, and the sustained cardiovascular demand occurs regardless of whether the stress is being managed in the behavioral and psychological sense. And the person who manages stress well is not, therefore, the person whose cardiovascular system is protected from the physiological effects of the stress, but is instead the person whose cardiovascular system is being affected by the stress without the person noticing, because the managing well removes the visible signal while leaving the physiological effect intact. Address the stress at the physiological level, rather than only at the behavioral and psychological level. The addressing at the physiological level means the genuine and sustained reduction of the chronic stress rather than the skilled management of its expression, and the genuine and sustained reduction requires the honest examination of what is producing the chronic stress and whether the producing of it can be changed, rather than the more comfortable examination of whether the response to it can be improved. The fourth part of the answer is the sleep, which I have addressed in other contexts and want to address briefly here, because the cardiovascular implications of insufficient sleep are among the most robustly established findings of the cardiovascular research of the past 2 decades, and because the person who is sleeping 6 hours a night while walking 5 miles every morning and eating sensibly is the person whose cardiovascular system is receiving mixed signals, in which the positive signal of the exercise and the diet is being partially offset by the negative signal of the sleep deprivation, and the offsetting is not visible in the standard monitoring, and is not felt as the discomfort that the body's other distress signals produce, and is therefore among the most consistently unaddressed of the modifiable cardiovascular risk factors. Sleep 8 hours. I have said this before, and I will keep saying it because the evidence for it is among the clearest in the cardiovascular literature, and because the dismissal of it as lifestyle advice rather than as medical necessity is the dismissal that my cardiologist told me is among the most consequential errors that otherwise health-conscious people make. I am 72 years old. I walk 5 miles every morning still, and I will walk 5 miles every morning for as long as my body allows it, and the walking is genuinely good for me and is not sufficient by itself, and was not sufficient by itself before the morning, and the understanding of its insufficiency is what the morning produced and what I most want to give you. The healthy lifestyle is necessary and not sufficient. The family history requires specific monitoring beyond the standard. The managed stress is still physiologically active. The sleep is as important as the exercise. And the confidence of the person who appears healthy is among the specific and consequential risk factors that none of the standard tests are measuring. Go to the doctor. Ask the specific questions that your family history and your lifestyle and your age indicate you should be asking. Do not assume that the satisfying numbers are the complete picture. My numbers were satisfying. The picture was not complete. The bench on the walking path on the Wednesday morning in October was where I found out. Find out before the bench. Please find out before the bench.